So now I'm so happy to introduce our final keynote speaker here to speak on equitable transportation, Leslie Aguayo, the Environmental Equity Program Manager at the Green Lining Institute. She is an urban planner and advocate with experience in poverty alleviation, asset building, affordable housing, equitable transportation, and community outreach strategies. So welcome, Leslie. Can I invite you on camera?
Hi, yes, thank you, Natalie, and thank you all for having me here. I'm Leslie Aguayo. I'm an Environmental Equity Program Manager with the Green Lining Institute located in Oakland, California. And today I prepared some slides. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so can I just get a thumbs up from someone that my screen is showing and that there are some slides on your screen?
We can see your slides, Leslie.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. So yes, like I was saying, I'm Leslie Aguayo. I work for the Green Lining Institute in Oakland, and I'm excited to share with you all the topic of why racial and gender equity matters in transportation. So for 28 years, the Green Lining Institute has set out to bring economic opportunities to low-income communities of color through research, policy, advocacy, and leadership development. And I hope that this presentation will inspire more conversations about this important intersection. Let me move the slides. Oh. There we go. So first, I'd like to start with how green lining defines equity. So we hold that equity is transforming the behaviors, institutions, and systems that disproportionately harm people of color. Equity means increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color to thrive and reach their full potential. And to be clear, equity is not the same thing as equality. As you can see through this image, equality is the assumption that the playing field is level. Equity, however, acknowledges that people are starting from very different places because of systemic injustices. An example of this is redlining. And so we at Green Lining are called green lining because we think it's an antidote to redlining. And I'll go ahead and explain a little bit more about what that is. So in order to share why race and gender matters in transportation policy and why we must lead with equity, I'm going to tell 3 stories today. First, I'm going to tell the story of the past and recount the history of race in America and how it relates to our built environment and economy. Then I'll tell the story of today and how the past manifests in pain and injustice for women and people of color. And finally, I'll tell you the story of tomorrow and how we can work together to create a society that is just, healthy, and where all people can thrive. So let's start with the story of the past. In the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, many families were struggling to make ends meet and were defaulting on their mortgages. In response, federal housing agencies began issuing government-backed mortgages to help post-war families build wealth through the Depression. However, not all families received help. Many historians credit this policy to helping families rebuild their lives during the crisis. But there is also a shameful side of this story that's not often talked about. It's one that's rooted in racism and one that our government and the real estate industry is directly responsible for. And it's called redlining. So to figure out how to distribute mortgages, governments worked with bankers and realtors to create maps to identify which neighborhoods to invest in based on risk. They created a grading system based on several factors like the quality of housing and others, but the primary indicator of risk was race. The neighborhoods were graded based on color codes that you can see here from these 4 maps. Green meant best, blue, still desirable, yellow, definitely declining, and red, hazardous. Areas that were redlined were seen as credit risks because of the presence of people of color. And this is where the term redlining comes from. And I want to share a quick fact that is very astonishing. Between 1932 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion of loans. More than 98% of that went to white families. This lack of investment in communities of color has led to extreme wealth inequality that we can still see along race lines today. And while redlining was technically outlawed decades ago, this lack of investment has had lingering impacts, particularly on our transportation system as well. And so another part of this story is the story of highways and the systematic redesign of our cities for the automobile. Highways were constructed often directly through communities of color. This destroyed local neighborhood economies and locked in air pollution and detrimental health impacts for decades to come. This neglect and disinvestment of the inner cities across the US only further disenfranchised communities of color. Redlining and highways were both born from America's long legacy of racist public policies, and today, subversive versions of redlining continue to take a toll on minorities such as women and people of color. And so now I'm going to transition into telling the story of today and how both women and people of color are still struggling with the legacy of racist policies, but also how we've begun to address them. Today, the current COVID-19 pandemic is pulling the curtains on America's deeply rooted inequities. People of color are the most impacted, with Latinx communities seeing some of the highest numbers of COVID cases, and African Americans making up the highest mortality rates. The economic impact associated with COVID is similarly impacting Black and Brown communities most severely. So when I saw this map of COVID-19 cases in San Francisco, I couldn't help but notice the striking similarities with the other two maps on the right, representing previously redlined communities and recent poverty and pollution burdens in the same locations. I also want to stress that both COVID-19 and racism are global pandemics with very real public health consequences. So it's not a surprise that COVID cases are disproportionately concentrated in the Latinx and Black community. In this graph, you see that Latinx and Black communities contain a higher percentage of cases compared to their share of the population. This data is from Alameda County, which encompasses a handful of cities in the East Bay, but it is representative of the US overall. If you notice, white people in Alameda County account for more than 40% of the population, but only make up 15% of COVID cases, whereas Latinx people account for 25% of COVID cases, but make up less than 25% of the population. Studies have also shown that women make up a majority of essential workers, unpaid caregivers, and domestic laborers, indicating that they are harder hit by COVID-19 than their male counterparts. In general, Black, Latinx, and Native communities have higher rates of pre-existing conditions and lead to greater risks of contracting COVID. At the same time, Asian American communities are experiencing increasing rates of xenophobia. And when you add that on top of the compounding risks that women carry, we can determine that women of color are bearing the brunt of this pandemic. If we keep in mind that women of color are more likely to live in poverty and depend on public transportation or older polluting vehicles to continue to make up the essential workforce, transportation isn't just a mode of physical mobility. It is most importantly a mode of upward economic mobility. So now let's talk about our last story. As we are making decisions about what kind of story we want to create for ourselves tomorrow, we have to keep in mind the stories of the past and present. The story of tomorrow is one where we don't just treat the symptoms of a broken system, but instead address systemic injustices and disparities. and in doing so, respond to real problems like climate change and economic inequality. I'm sure many of you have seen the consequences of climate change ravaging our country. I, for one, am currently located in Northern California, in the front row of some of last year's California forest fires, and can tell you firsthand how difficult those few weeks were, with many people experiencing not only the loss of life, the loss of their homes and safety, but also climate grief, a very real psychological response through anxiety and depression due to the impacts of climate destruction. So we can talk about mitigating climate change, but regardless of how much we lessen our greenhouse gas emissions, especially from transportation, the climate is still going to change and will continue to impact some communities more than others. The reason we have inequities in climate impacts is because of racist policies like redlining. Communities of color, specifically Black and Brown neighborhoods, have been and continue to be isolated into undesirable geographic areas that are more susceptible to climate change impacts. Not only are they more geographically vulnerable, they often lack reliable transportation options in the event of an emergency. And because of a lack of intergenerational wealth, these frontline communities will have a much more difficult time rebuilding their lives after natural disasters. So what can we do about this? Times are changing, cities are raising the bar on equity, and business as usual is not going to cut it anymore. We have new standards for how mobility services must benefit communities. As a result, some mobility companies are following suit, and now we have equity programs within their services. Clearly, equity is becoming mainstream, which is a good thing for the most part, because as equity becomes mainstream, there is a risk that it can turn into an empty promise if there is no strategy to achieve that promise. The consequences of not delivering on equity commitments can be even more harmful to our communities and to confidence in government. We have to get this right, because equity is not a commitment, it's a practice. So at Greenlining, we've developed this 4-step process where we determine what are the necessary steps to be able to make equity real. And so with any mobility project, plan, or program, equity must be embedded in 1, the mission, vision, and values, 2, the process, 3, the implementation and outcomes, and 4, the measurement and analysis. So here are some questions that I think are helpful in guiding communities, organizations, and individuals on some things that they can ask themselves on how to achieve and make equity real. When it comes to addressing the very real disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, we have urged agencies to commit to a just response that embeds an ease of the immediate burdens on communities, that delivers prosperity and opportunity, that builds long-term resilience, and incorporates this making equity real framework as mentioned in these steps. So some say that the pursuit of equity slows us down in reaching the clean energy future that we desperately need, but it doesn't. And in fact, we won't reach our climate goals if equity is not baked in from the very beginning, considering people of color and women, as well as other kinds of intersectional identities. If we fail to put equity at the center of our sustainability policies, this will only create new problems and new injustices that we will then have to face down the road. Equity is not an obstacle to progress and innovation, it's the foundation. And I think we're getting to a point where more and more people are starting to see that. We will see the return on our investment in equity when all people, regardless of their race, income, ability, gender, age, or zip code, have access to what they need to thrive in a clean energy future. Just imagine how much this world would benefit from if everyone has healthy environments and the entire economy is prosperous. Poor communities of color and the women who sustain them continue to suffer most from the legacy of segregation and racially motivated policies that have led to horrible exposure to pollution and toxins in their neighborhoods. As we collectively navigate these unprecedented times that have brought racial inequities to a head, it's paramount that we center race and gender to advance environmental equity for the protection and investment of communities most burdened by these compounding COVID-19, climate change, racial injustice, and gender inequities. Equity can bind us together to make us stronger and more resilient. Thank you.